October 1941, occupied France. A sentry stands on guard. His boots are planted, his rifle slung loose, breath fogging the inside of his helmet as he scans a road that has been quiet for hours. He is tired, cold, and alone. Suddenly, he hears a noise. Moments later, one arm locks across the mouth and jaw, forcing his head back. The body stiffens once, then collapses. This is not combat. This is a true depiction in the art of stealth. But it is also an incident that shaped the direction of the entire war. In this video, we examine the Fairbairn Sykes Fighting Knife, one of the most feared weapons of Nazi Germany. But to understand why Britain needed such a tool, we must return to the moment when the war turned inward, away from front lines and toward sentries, checkpoints, stairwells, and the brutal mathematics of distance measured in inches. By late 1941, Britain had entered a phase of the war that was neither neat nor conventional. Large battles still mattered, but they no longer told the whole story. Across occupied Europe, control was maintained not by divisions in the field, but by individuals, lone sentries, patrolmen, guards at doors and stairwells, men whose purpose was not to fight, but to observe, challenge, and raise the alarm. For Britain's emerging sabotage and resistance strategy, those men posed a lethal obstacle. A single sentry could stop a courier carrying radio parts. He could expose a safe house. He could turn a quiet insertion into a running gunfight that drew in reinforcements within minutes. The margin for error was vanishingly small. If a guard was engaged, it had to be done decisively. If he made noise, the operation was already lost. Firearms were an unreliable answer. Even suppressed weapons produced mechanical noise and unpredictable echoes, especially indoors. Missed shots happened, so did jams. A pistol was useful only if everything went exactly to plan, a rare luxury in darkness, fatigue, and fear. Unarmed techniques were taught, but they carried their own risks. Strangulation took time. Blows could fail to incapacitate. A struggle, however brief, gave a man the chance to shout, fire, or simply fall in a way that drew attention. In occupied territory, seconds mattered. Knives were already in use, but most were ill-suited to the task. Utility blades, bayonets, private purchases, all designed for cutting, chopping, or general service. They required movement, strength, and repeated actions. In tight spaces, that translated directly into danger. British trainers began to recognize a hard truth. Silent killing was not about ferocity or courage. It was about anatomy and geometry, about angles of entry, blade length, and reaching vital organs with absolute certainty. The difference between success and failure was measured not in skill, but in inches. What Britain needed was not a fighting knife in the traditional sense, but a specialized instrument, one designed for a single purpose, carried out quickly, quietly, and without hesitation. Finding that solution would mean discarding centuries of conventional blade design and turning instead to experience forged far from the battlefield, in places where violence was close, sudden, and unforgiving. The search for such a weapon did not begin in an armory, nor within the traditions of the British Army. It began in classrooms, gymnasiums, and improvised training halls, where a new kind of instruction was taking shape. Close combat, not as sport or drill, but as applied lethality. By 1940, Britain was racing to build forces capable of operating independently behind enemy lines. Commandos, raiders, saboteurs, and irregular units required training that conventional manuals could not provide. Bayonet drill and parade ground swordsmanship had little relevance in a stairwell at night. Responsibility for solving this problem fell to men whose experience sat uncomfortably alongside orthodox military thinking. William Ewart Fairbairn and Eric Anthony Sykes had not learned their trade in uniformed formations, but as officers of the Shanghai Municipal Police. There, during the interwar years, they had dealt with gang violence, riots, assassinations, and sudden intimate encounters where hesitation was fatal. Their conclusions were blunt. Real violence was fast. It was ugly. It occurred at arm's length or closer, and it ended in seconds. Training, they believed, had to reflect that reality, and so did the tools. At facilities such as the Special Training Centre at Lochaillot and later commando depots across Britain, Fairbairn and Sykes were tasked with building an entire doctrine of silent killing. Techniques were stripped of flourish. Movements were simplified. The objective was not dominance, but termination. Early experiments with existing knives quickly revealed shortcomings. Too thick, too short, too balanced for slashing rather than thrusting. What Fairbairn wanted was a blade that disappeared into the hand and extended naturally from the forearm, something that guided itself toward vital targets without conscious adjustment. Material shortages complicated matters. Wartime Britain could not afford ornamental design or exotic alloys. Production had to be simple, repeatable, and scalable. The blade needed to be thin enough for penetration, yet strong enough not to snap. The grip had to function in rain, blood, mud, and darkness. Working with Sheffield manufacturers, designs were refined through iteration rather than committee. Prototypes were handled, discarded, modified, and tested repeatedly in training environments that simulated real conditions as closely as possible. If a design caught on clothing, reflected light, or encouraged unnecessary movement, it was rejected. Secrecy was absolute. This was not a weapon intended for mass issue or parade display. It was meant for a narrow audience and a narrow task. Even its appearance was deliberately understated. Symmetrical, unadorned, almost clinical. By the time a final pattern emerged, the knife was no longer a compromise between tool and weapon. It was something else entirely, a physical expression of a doctrine that accepted without sentiment what Britain was asking certain men to do in the shadows. What remained was to formalize that design and to decide whether the army was truly prepared to issue a blade built for such a singular and unsettling purpose. The weapon that emerged from this process was given no dramatic title and carried no symbolic flourish. Officially, it was simply designated the Fairbairn Sykes Fighting Knife, named after the two men who shaped its doctrine and form. At first glance, it appeared almost unremarkable. A slim, double-edged blade, a narrow grip, a symmetrical profile that offered no obvious right or wrong side. Yet every aspect of its design was deliberate. This was not a general-purpose knife. It was not intended to cut rope, open tins, or pry open crates. Its sole function was penetration. The blade was long, thin, and acutely pointed, optimized to slip between ribs and reach vital organs with minimal resistance. The double edge ensured effectiveness regardless of angle or orientation in darkness. The handle was equally purposeful. Cylindrical, lightly textured, and balanced to align naturally with the forearm, it allowed the knife to be driven forward instinctively, without the user needing to look or adjust grip. Instructors taught that if the blade was in the hand already knew where to put it. Issued initially to commandos and later to airborne and special units, the knife quickly became embedded in training doctrine. It was presented not as a weapon of choice, but as a last resort, a tool for moments when silence was mandatory and distance had collapsed to nothing. Yet in adopting it, the British military crossed a quiet threshold. This was a blade designed expressly for killing without warning. Its very existence acknowledged that modern war had created situations where such acts were not incidental, but essential. Understanding what that meant in practice requires looking more closely at the knife itself, not as an icon, but as a piece of engineering built to serve a single, unsettling requirement. The Fairbairn Sykes Fighting Knife was engineered around a single mechanical principle: reliable penetration under stress. Every design choice flows from that requirement, and anything that did not serve it was deliberately excluded. The blade is the defining feature. Long, narrow, and double-edged, it was designed to pierce rather than cut. Unlike utility knives or bayonets, which rely on mass or chopping force, the Fairbairn Sykes relies on geometry. Its thin cross-section reduces resistance as it enters the body, allowing it to pass between ribs and through muscle with minimal effort. The sharply tapered point concentrates force onto a very small area, ensuring penetration even when the strike is imperfect or delivered at an angle. Blade length varied slightly between production patterns, but the intent remained constant. Sufficient reach to access vital organs from multiple angles without requiring exaggerated movement. This was critical in confined spaces where large swings were impossible and dangerous. The double edge served a practical purpose. In darkness, orientation becomes uncertain. A blade that cuts only on one side demands visual confirmation or fine motor control, both unreliable under stress. With two sharpened edges, The knife remains effective regardless of how it is held or driven forward. The grip was equally intentional. Cylindrical and symmetrical, it avoided finger grooves, guards, or contours that might dictate hand position. Instead, it allowed the user to grip instinctively. Balance was carefully tuned so that the blade felt like a direct extension of the forearm, reducing the need for conscious alignment. The lightly textured surface improved purchase when wet, but avoided aggressive checkering that could abrade the hand during prolonged carry. Early patterns featured smooth grips. Later versions incorporated subtle knurling. The small crossguard was not intended for parrying, an unrealistic expectation in silent combat, but to prevent the hand sliding forward during thrusting. It was kept minimal to avoid snagging on clothing or equipment. Steel choice reflected wartime reality. High-carbon steel was used for its ability to take and hold a sharp edge, but this came at the cost of corrosion resistance. The knife required care. Blackened or blued finishes were applied to reduce reflection, but these coatings offered limited protection. Rust was a constant enemy, and training manuals emphasized maintenance. The scabbard was more than an accessory. It was designed for silent draw and resheathing, with minimal movement and no metal-on-metal contact. Elastic retainers and tight tolerances ensured the knife would not fall free during movement, yet could be drawn instantly with one hand. Importantly, the Fairbairn Sykes made no attempt to be versatile. It could not chop, pry, or perform camp tasks well. This was a conscious trade-off. Every additional function would have required compromises in thickness, balance, or edge geometry, compromises the designers refused to make. In engineering terms, the knife is brutally honest. It does one thing extremely well and almost nothing else. That clarity of purpose explains both its effectiveness in training and its discomforting reputation. The real question, however, was not whether it worked in theory, but how it performed once issued, taught, and carried into the uncertain realities of war. Going back to our scene in occupied France, moments like this were never meant to be recorded. If a sentry disappeared, the success of the operation depended on nobody noticing why. The knife's role ended the instant the body was moved from view. This was the environment for which the Fairbairn Sykes had been created. Darkness, proximity, compressed time. The blade was not meant to dominate a fight, because there was no allowance for a fight to begin. Its value lay in how quickly it resolved a problem before it could develop consequences. Yet training grounds and controlled demonstrations could only go so far. Real conditions introduced variables no design could eliminate: fatigue, weather, imperfect positioning, unexpected movement. A knife optimized for silent killing offered no forgiveness if something went wrong. For those issued the Fairbairn Sykes, carrying it was an acknowledgement that they might be required to operate at the narrowest possible margin between success and exposure. Whether the knife justified that trust, and how it ultimately fit into Britain's wider conduct of clandestine war, can only be understood by examining what happened after it left the instructor's hands and entered the field. Once the Fairbairn Sykes knife left the training halls and entered service, it did so quietly and without ceremony. The knife existed in a part of the war that resisted documentation by design. In training, its effectiveness was clear. Recruits learned that the blade required less strength than expected, less motion than traditional knives, and far less time. Instructors emphasized repetition and muscle memory rather than flourish. The knife performed consistently under controlled conditions, and its simplicity proved to be its greatest asset. There were few moving parts, nothing to jam, and nothing to explain once it was in the hand. Operationally, the picture is less precise. The nature of clandestine warfare meant that silent eliminations, if they occurred, were rarely described in detail and often not recorded at all. After-action reports focused on objectives achieved or failed, not on the specific tools used along the way. Where knives are mentioned, they are typically referenced generically rather than by pattern. What can be said with confidence is that the Fairbairn Sykes became embedded in doctrine. It was issued widely to commandos, airborne forces, and other specialist units. It appeared in training manuals, instructional films, and close combat courses throughout the war. Its form was standardized, refined, and reproduced at scale, a sign that the British military regarded it as a solved problem rather than an experimental one. At the same time, its limitations were understood. The knife was never a universal solution. It was useless at range. It demanded proximity. It required commitment. Against an alert, armed opponent in open terrain, it offered no advantage. As the war progressed and suppressed firearms, explosives, and diversionary tactics improved, the knife increasingly occupied a narrow niche. There were also practical concerns. The thin blade, while excellent for penetration, was vulnerable to bending or snapping if misused. Corrosion remained an issue in wet climates, and unlike a firearm, a knife offered no second chance. If the initial action failed, the situation escalated immediately. Despite this, the knife's symbolic value grew. It became associated with elite units and specialized roles. Carried openly or worn on ceremonial uniforms after the war, it acquired a reputation that far exceeded its actual use. What had been designed as a discrete solution to a specific problem was transformed in peacetime memory into an emblem of aggression and resolve. That transformation obscures an important truth. The Fairbairn Sykes did not change the war through widespread battlefield use. It did not alter campaigns or strategies on its own. Its real significance lies elsewhere, in what it reveals about how Britain adapted to a form of warfare that demanded uncomfortable solutions. The knife represents a moment when doctrine, engineering, and necessity aligned around a grim conclusion, that certain tasks required tools stripped of versatility, sentiment, and ambiguity. In that sense, its legacy is not measured by confirmed kills or documented missions, but by the fact that it remained in service, in form if not always in function, long after the conditions that created it had passed. By the end of the war, the Fairbairn Sykes was no longer essential. Britain's clandestine capabilities had evolved. Yet the knife endured, not because it was perfect, but because it captured, with unsettling clarity, the realities of a war fought in silence, at close range, and without witnesses. And that leaves one final question. Not about how the knife was used, but about what it came to represent once the war was over. If the sentry was missed on the morning roll call, the explanation would be mundane. Desertion, illness, a paperwork error. In occupied Europe, men vanished regularly enough for absence to attract little notice, provided it happened quietly. That was the space the Fairbairn Sykes knife was designed to inhabit. Not the battlefield, not the charge, not the clash of forces, but the moment before any of that could occur. Its success was defined by what did not happen next. No alarm, no pursuit, no report worth filing. The blade did not win engagements or alter front lines. It did not shorten the war. Instead, it served a narrower, more unsettling purpose. It acknowledged that modern conflict had created situations where a single individual, acting alone and unseen, could determine whether an operation lived or died. In time, the knife outgrew that role in the public imagination. It became a symbol of commandos, of aggression, of elite status, polished, ceremonial, detached from the circumstances that demanded its creation. What was once a specialized solution hardened into legend. Yet stripped of myth, the Fairbairn Sykes remains an artifact of necessity rather than bravado. It reflects a moment when Britain accepted that survival required tools built without ambiguity, for tasks that could not be discussed openly or remembered comfortably. The sentry, the road, the silence, those details were never meant to endure. The knife did. Not because it glorified violence, but because it revealed how far the war had pushed those tasked with fighting it. And in that sense, its legacy is not found in stories of use, but in the fact that such a weapon was deemed necessary at all.